Welcome to the Time Capsule. This episode, we take a look at May 1997 and give you a snapshot of what the gaming world looked like nearly 25 years ago. 1997. Bill Clinton was the President of the United States, and no one had heard of Monica Lewinsky. The Twin Towers still stood proud, and people were flocking to movie theaters to watch The Fifth Element and the very first Austin Powers movie. Times were good in the world and in video games. With the N64 launching just the summer before and the mighty PlayStation really hitting its stride, people were more excited than ever for the future of gaming. In issue 96 of Nintendo Power from May 1997, it's clear that Nintendo is ramping up for the release of Star Fox 64 with a 6-page spread dedicated to Fox and the gang. Little did they know just a few months before release that it would become the most beloved Star Fox game in the franchise, a sentiment that is still held by fans of the series to this day. Only a cursory mention of GoldenEye 64 appears in the issue, listed amongst the other upcoming releases for summer 1997, along with a holiday 1997 release announcement for Zelda 64, which, as you know, would be renamed The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Unfortunately for the fans, they would have to wait all the way till holiday 1998 to actually play what would become one of the most beloved games not only on the N64, but in the history of gaming. Strangely, looking back on it now, Nintendo dedicated 12 pages to FIFA 64, which had just released the month before, so I guess it was hot off the presses as they were putting the May issue together, but still, 12 pages on an ultimately forgettable game and barely a byline for GoldenEye 64 seems to indicate that they really didn't see the success of Rare's iconic first-person shooter coming and had no idea that it would be destined to become one of the most iconic games ever released on the N64. The cover of May 1997's GamePro magazine offers a hint at the epic future of the Final Fantasy series. Final Fantasy VII, which was released in Japan a few months earlier, was already getting significant attention as potentially one of the best JRPGs ever made. GamePro gives a 2-page review of the Japanese version, chock full of high praise, ahead of the American release, which was slated for September 97 by Sony Entertainment America. It's also worth noting that the guys at GamePro really had their fingers on the pulse of gaming, doing a half-page spread on Metal Gear Solid, which was slated for Japanese release in September of 97, but it would be another full year before we saw it on Western consoles. The average gamer had no idea of the potential of Hideo Kojima at this point, but GamePro knew enough to be excited nonetheless. In GamePro issue 104 from May 1997, an interesting tidbit of news, something that I think is mostly lost to history, really pops out of the page here on page 22. A little byline: Sega merges with Bandai. Two wobbly companies have merged to form one really big wobbly company. That's what some financial analysts are saying after Sega and Bandai got together in February and morphed into a huge new company to be called Sega Bandai. The deal, worth over $1 billion, should be finalized October 1. The merger comes at a time when both companies are struggling for an identity in the video games market. Both Sega and Bandai have taken serious financial hits in recent years after finding successes earlier in the decade. Sega, locked in third place in the system wars behind Nintendo and Sony, had already announced that it would lose an incredible $200 million in the fiscal year that ended March 31st. Bandai, best known for creating the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, has seen that license take a nosedive since 1995. What's more, the Apple Pippin, the game system for kids that Bandai sunk $130 million into, has been a disaster according to most analysts. The new Sega Bandai regime will be headed by familiar names. The chairman will be Sega's current chairman, Isao Okawa. Bandai's president, Makoto Yamashina, will assume the role of Sega Bandai's president. They'll oversee a company with over $6 billion in revenue and about 400 US employees working in Northern California. Their mission will be to successfully meld Sega's video game potential, its coin-op titles, and its arcade holdings in Japan and the US with Bandai's toy products. High on Bandai's hot list of product right now is the latest toy addiction in Japan, a keyring with an electronic egg called a Tamagotchi. The gadget features an electronic chick that grows to adulthood if properly nourished. Sega's longtime rival responded to the news with a big yawn. Nintendo spokesperson said they had no worries about the new Sega Bandai, flush with its remarkable Nintendo 64 success in the US. Nintendo is pretty busy these days trying to ramp up production of N64s to meet the worldwide demand. The company hopes to ship 1 million N64s around the world every month, up from 700,000, just as the system is about to launch in Europe. So, this really brings to mind the question, whatever happened to this? A Sega Bandai merger could have been potentially earth-shattering at a time when Sega was moving through the Saturn and coming up to the Dreamcast. So the question that's raised by all this is, whatever happened to Sega Bandai? This is a super interesting piece of information. I found an article on Wired. I'll just bring that up here. Bandai calls off planned merger with Sega. The move came after Bandai's board decided that the two companies wouldn't be such a good fit after all. A pending merger between fun and games powerhouse Sega Enterprises and Bandai was called off suddenly Tuesday when Bandai's board of directors decided the two companies wouldn't be such a good fit after all. What scotched the deal was opposition from mid-level Bandai execs who apparently saw the culture of their family-run business at odds with Sega's more buttoned-down corporate ways. Sega's poor showing in the video game sweepstakes against rivals Nintendo and Sony may have been another factor, especially as sales boomed for Bandai's Tamagotchi virtual pets. The merger had been in the works since January and was scheduled to be finalized in October. Under the original stock swap plans, Sega would have taken control of Bandai's assets, a prospect that prompted many Bandai employees to write angry letters to their company's management. Opposition to the deal grew so intense that Bandai's board met to review the plan Monday and subsequently informed Sega that the merger was off. As a face-saving move, Bandai offered to enter into a less formal business alliance, and Sega announced that this would be acceptable. According to some reports, many Sega execs also had reservations about the deal, fearing they would gain little in their efforts to restore life to the company's game titles. They also worried that Bandai employees would not respond well to Sega's more traditional management practices. So, this is really something for the history books. I was not aware of this deal at all. It really raises the question of what could have been Sega's future with the influence of Bandai. Obviously, Bandai has gone on to join up with Namco, and they're definitely a pretty popular and beloved game developer at this point. Would the influence of Bandai in the late 90s been enough to save the Sega Saturn and potentially give a better start to the Dreamcast? I guess we'll never know. Games that released in the first half of 1997 include the first Diablo on the PS1, Mario Kart 64, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, Turok Dinosaur Hunter, the first Harvest Moon on the Super Nintendo. Crazy they were still releasing Super Nintendo games well into the N64's lifespan. Final Fantasy Tactics, man what a classic, Star Fox 64, and then gamers were looking forward to games like Mega Man X4, GoldenEye 007, Tomb Raider 2, Crash Bandicoot 2, and so many more in the second half of 1997. Tips and Tricks issue 27 gives an 8-page walkthrough of another beloved game on the PS1, Vandal Hearts. And if the Sega Saturn was your thing, they had a 4-page tutorial on Die Hard Arcade, which had hit store shelves in the beginning of the year. The age of the cheat code is largely forgotten in this day and age, at least amongst younger gamers, but this magazine was an absolute treasure trove of information, giving awesome tips and codes for games like Yoshi's Island, Duke Nukem 3D, Shining the Holy Ark, and so many more. They followed it up with part 2 of an in-depth look at Turok Dinosaur Hunter on the N64 with 10 pages of maps and step-by-step tutorials to get you through the game. Remember, in 1997, the internet was basically AOL and Netscape Navigator on a dial-up connection, and the answer to every question was just not there yet. People relied on magazines like this one to give them the information they needed. Issue 29 of Next Generation, May 1997, has a 22-page feature on the Nintendo 64. It's worth noting this is only a year or so into the N64's lifespan, and the headline is Nintendo 64 Breaking Up? Nintendo promised quality, not quantity, says the author, for N64 software, but the handful of mediocre games released so far honor only half this deal. So can Nintendo's 1997 lineup get its 64-bit Wonder Console back on track? A next-gen report. So just taking a look at the article here, it really dives into the fact that even only a year into the lifespan of the N64, People were already starting to doubt its ability to keep up with the PlayStation and other consoles on the market. The N64 was technically more powerful than the PlayStation 1 and potentially could produce better 3D graphics than the PlayStation. The decision to go with a cartridge-based media rather than a disc at a time when developers were increasingly pushing to make bigger and bigger games with more and more content, more and more cinematics, just really pushed the envelope of what could be done on the N64. Just looking at the article here, it says, Howard Lincoln proclaimed, "I don't care if we have as many games as Sony or Sega. What I care about is whether the games are any good or not." Once again, he was articulating Nintendo's strategy and promise to gamers of quality, not quantity, when it comes to the business of releasing N64 games. But have the titles lived up to this promise? The answer is yes, when considering the two first-party titles like Mario 64 and Wave Race 64, but a resounding no in almost every other instance. N64 is a great hardware that easily accommodates AAA titles in the right hands. Mario 64 proves this, so consumers should be asking when the rest of the AAA titles are due to arrive. For that matter, how about the AA and single-A titles? To date, N64 has only delivered 2 5-star games and is averaging 3 stars in Next Generation's Finals section. In fact, beyond Pilot Wing 64, a second-party game given special attention to from Nintendo, not a single game made outside of Nintendo has managed to break the 3-star threshold. Certainly not all games are bad, but classics are decidedly thin on the ground, and the overall library is far cry from the everyone's a winner dream promised at Nintendo 64's launch. And this is why we're taking a stance that many will see as aggressive towards Nintendo. It's not that we're believers in the company and in the hardware, we are. But the games simply aren't up to scratch, and someone has to tell them. So this really brings into question, today we can look back at the N64 and see a system that had great potential, while it was Nintendo's choice to use cartridges which limited the developers and really put them in a place where they didn't want to develop for the N64. We take a look here at the announcement of the Nintendo 64 disk drive. The article says, can Nintendo's writable 64DD peripheral be the answer to N64 software dilemma? And even if it can, will gamers buy into it? Back in May 1994, Nintendo announced that the Nintendo 64 would be cartridge-based, and in doing so sent waves of shock and near bewilderment through the video game industry. Until that point, CD-ROM had been more or less accepted as the future of video gaming, CDs being cheap to produce and capable of holding up to 650 megabytes of data. To many it seemed odd that Nintendo should fall back on the outmoded cartridge format. A year later, though, the company unveiled its plans for the bulky drive peripheral, a proprietary storage system based around magneto-optical technology which boasts faster access times than standard CDs and is rewritable. The device, which is scheduled for release at the end of 1997, has a 64 megabyte capacity and is designed to sit beneath the Nintendo 64, connecting to it via a port in the console's base. There are two main advantages to this unique system. Most obviously, it means that games can be released that require both a cartridge and a disc, a vital Nintendo for titles like Legend of Zelda 64, which features huge, fully explorable worlds that simply would not fit on a cartridge alone. Second, each bulky disk drive has 26 megabits of writable space available, which enables users to store their own data, and so paves the way for Nintendo to realize customizable games. So again, what we're looking at here is, in May of 1997, people were really not sure whether the N64 was going to be capable of handling the types of games that they were becoming accustomed to on the PlayStation 1, and people were actually looking favorably towards the DD add-on for the N64 as a potential solution for the problem. It's kind of unfortunate that Nintendo didn't really follow through with that and only released a very few titles for the N64 DD. Remains to be seen, had they supported that, whether N64 would have got more traction in the end. It's worth noting, as seen in Next Generation issue 29, that you see here console gaming was not the only thing gamers were excited about. PC gaming was hitting a major high in the late 90s as more and more families had computers in their houses. Games like Doom, Quake, the first Fallout, and RTS games like Command & Conquer and Age of Empires ruled the day. Computer users have always thought of themselves as the master race, but as PC hardware got more powerful and 3D accelerators became more common, it became absolutely clear that games could be larger, longer, and more complex on just about any modern computer, and high-end machines could put out graphics that would put any console to shame. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this look back to May 1997. Let me know in the comments if this is something you'd like to see more of. The next episode, we will be going back to the pre-NES era to take a look at gaming in the early 80s with systems such as the Atari 2600, the ColecoVision, and the Intellivision systems, plus PC gaming on systems like the Commodore 64, the Coleco Adam, and the Amiga. Don't forget to hit the like button on your way out, it does help out a ton, and please stay tuned for the next video. Stay classy.